Margaret Wilson had lived in the same small, sun-faded house on Willoughby Street for more than 40 years. It was a simple place, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, and a narrow living room filled with dusty picture frames and quiet memories. Most days, the house sat in complete silence, except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Silence had become a familiar companion to Margaret, one she never grew fond of, but one she had learned to accept. Margaret was 70 years old, but the loneliness she carried had aged her far more than time ever could. Her silver hair was always neatly brushed back, and she wore soft cardigans that hung a bit too loose on her fragile frame. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned to take measured steps so the world wouldn't collapse beneath her feet. Every morning, at exactly 8:30 a.m., she sat in her floral armchair by the window, holding a cup of warm tea in her trembling hands. She would stare at the phone placed on the table beside her, an old landline with buttons that had faded from years of hopeful dialing. Some days, she hoped it would ring. Other days, she feared it might ring too late. For 27 years, Margaret had been waiting for a call from her son, Michael. When people asked why, she simply smiled and said, "Because he promised he would call." Most people nodded politely and moved on. Some offered sympathetic glances. Others whispered behind her back about how that poor old woman still believes in miracles. But to Margaret, it wasn't a miracle she was waiting for. It was closure, a voice, a moment, something to tell her the distance between them wasn't entirely her fault. Her story began nearly 3 decades earlier, long before the wrinkles carved into her skin and before the steady loneliness settled into her bones. Back then, Margaret was a full-time nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital. She had raised Michael alone after her husband passed away from a sudden heart attack when their son was only 6. Life had been hard, grueling shifts, double jobs, exhausted nights, but she loved her son fiercely, sometimes too fiercely. Michael had grown up feeling trapped by her protectiveness. When he was 17, arguments became common. Margaret pleaded for him to stay safe, to choose a stable path, to avoid the mistakes she had seen so many young patients make. But Michael wanted freedom, wanted space to breathe, to grow, to be more than the cautious shadow of her fears. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Michael packed a bag and left. He stood in the doorway with his jaw tight and eyes full of teenage anger. "You don't trust me," he said. "I'm trying to protect you," Margaret whispered. "Well, maybe I don't need protecting anymore." He stepped outside, slamming the door behind him. But before walking off the porch, he turned back and said, "I'll call you tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Years passed. His number changed, his friends disappeared. Margaret searched for him, called hospitals, shelters, old classmates, but every lead led nowhere. Eventually, people told her to accept reality, to move on, to let go. But how does a mother let go of the only child she has? It was late autumn now, and the leaves outside Margaret's window had turned deep shades of orange and red. A gust of wind sent them swirling across the yard like tiny dancers performing for no audience. Margaret watched them drift past the fence, feeling a strange kinship with their quiet, directionless movement. Her neighbor, Claire, a cheerful woman in her 40s, often checked in on her. On this particular morning, Claire stopped by with a small box of pastries. "You should get out more," Claire insisted gently as she placed the box on the Margaret's dining table. "There's a fall festival in town this weekend. We could go together." Margaret smiled, appreciating the offer, even though she knew she'd turn it down. "I'm not much for festivals anymore," she said softly. "It might be good for you. Fresh air, music, new faces." "I like the faces I already know." Margaret glanced at a framed photograph of 16-year-old Michael with messy hair and a shy smile. Claire followed her gaze, her expression softened. "Still no word?" she asked carefully. Margaret headed her head. No, but I believe he's out there. I believe he remembers me, even if he can't find his way back. Claire reached out and gently squeezed Margaret's hand. You deserve peace, she whispered. Peace. The word lingered in the air like a distant melody Margaret could hear but never reach. That evening, Margaret reheated leftover soup and sat in her armchair again. The house felt quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She took a sip of soup, turned on the lamp beside her, and opened the book she had been rereading for the third time that month. But she couldn't focus. 27 years was a long time, long enough to lose hope, long enough to heal, long enough to forget. But Margaret had done none of those things. Her memories were still vivid. The smell of Michael's shampoo, the sound of his laughter, the look on his face when he ran across the yard with a new kite. These memories lived inside her like tiny lanterns in a dark house. They kept her warm, even as the world outside grew colder. Around 10 p.m., she went to her bedroom. The sheets were tidy, the room organized. She always kept it that way. Routine gave her comfort. Predictability made the loneliness easier to manage. She slipped under the blankets and closed her eyes. And then, the phone rang. It was so sudden that she thought she might be dreaming. Her heart jolted, and she sat up quickly, breath trembling. The phone rang again. She hurried out of bed, her knees weak, reaching for the landline in the living room. Her fingers shook as she lifted it to her ear. Hello? She whispered. There was static, a faint breath, then a voice. Mom? Margaret froze. Her eyes filled instantly. Her hand trembled so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Michael? She whispered. There was silence, a long, heavy pause that made her heart ache. I didn't know if you'd pick up, the voice said. Margaret sank into the armchair, gripping the phone with both hands. I've been waiting for 27 years, she said softly. I know, he replied, voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Tears streamed down her cheeks, falling onto her nightgown like tiny drops of forgiveness. Are you okay? Where have you been? Are you safe? I'm okay now. Life was hard. I made so many mistakes. I didn't want to come back until I had something to offer, until I wasn't a disappointment. You were never a disappointment, she whispered firmly. Never. I was angry and scared, and I thought if I stayed away long enough, the guilt would fade. But it didn't. It only grew. Margaret closed her eyes. I'm just glad you're alive, she said. That's all I ever wanted. There was a shaky breath on the other end. I want to see you, if you'll have me. A soft smile formed through her tears. I've been waiting to hear those words for so long. I can drive up tomorrow morning. I'm only a few hours away. Her heart fluttered. Tomorrow, after all these years. Yes, she whispered. Come home, Michael. When the call ended, Margaret held the phone to her chest. The silence that followed felt different. No longer heavy, no longer cold. It felt full, like the house was finally exhaling after decades of holding a breath. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her armchair watching the first hints of dawn creep across the sky. Morning came with soft pink light stretching across Willoughby Street. Margaret cleaned the house with an energy she hadn't felt in years. She dusted the picture frames, polished the silverware, opened the windows to let fresh air sweep into every corner. Around 11 a.m., she heard a car pull into the driveway. Her heart raced. She opened the door slowly. A man stood at the bottom of the steps, older, tired-looking, with the same hazel eyes she knew from long ago. He carried a small duffel bag and a face of hesitation. "Mom," he said. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand as tears filled her eyes again. Michael took a small step forward. She stepped down towards him, and then, without another word, they embraced. It wasn't the embrace of a mother and son reuniting after a week apart. It was the embrace of decades lost, wounds unspoken, and forgiveness long overdue. Michael's arms wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, and Margaret pressed her chest against his chest, listening to the heartbeat she had feared she'd never hear again. "I'm here," he whispered, "and I'm not leaving again." She nodded, unable to speak. When they finally stepped inside, the house felt alive for the first time in years. Michael looked at the old photos, the familiar walls, the small marks he had made as a child on the doorframe. Memories washed over both of them like gentle waves. They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret made tea just as she had always done, and Michael watched her with a mix of nostalgia and regret. "You look smaller," he said quietly. "You look older."